Welcome to today's Realm Mid-Atlantic webinar. Realm Mid-Atlantic serves Delaware, the District of Columbia, Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. As you probably know, the Regional Educational Laboratories, or RELs, are the Institute of Education Sciences, the research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. Our primary mission is to form research alliances with educators and policymakers to help states and school districts use research results to answer important questions about education policy and practice. Our services include direct research and technical assistance products and services. This webinar falls into the category of technical assistance, which includes bridge events, trainings, workshops, how-to guides, and white papers. Through webinars like this one, we hope to reach educators who are interested in but are unable to attend our live bridge events. Our goal for the webinar series is to provide an online space for conversation where you can work with experts and with your colleagues on the education challenges that you care about. At the end of each session, we'll ask you to rate us by completing a brief survey. Your input is important and will help us to better serve your needs. We hope that you'll find this webinar informative and engaging. And now, let's get started.
The Teacher Effectiveness Webinar Series is a forum for providing stakeholders in the Mid-Atlantic region and beyond with opportunities to discuss topics within the field of teacher effectiveness. One of our goals for this series is to increase participants' understanding of research-based teacher effectiveness strategies and the application to your practice in the local context. So now we'd like to know who is joining us for the webinar today. You'll see a poll pop up on your screen, and we'd like you to select the answer choice that best reflects the role that you fill professionally.
Oh, you can only do one.
Looks like we have quite a few researchers and public policy staff joining us today. Glad to see that we have some school-based and district-level teachers and administrators with us. It's quite a diverse audience. Okay, I think we're ready to get started with the presentation. Today, our presenter is Dr. Dan Goldhaber. He's the director for the Center for Education Data and Research. He's a professor in interdisciplinary arts and sciences at the University of Bothell. And his focus is on educational productivity and reform. He's focused on human capital policies related to the composition, distribution, and quality of teachers in the workforce. And he also focuses on connections between the K-12 experience.
Researchers have focused on most, and it's where there's been some real interesting experiments that have gone. So we sort of know most from an empirical sense about pay for performance, but really restructuring pay is much broader than that, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the broader ways that restructuring pay might affect the labor market as well. So just sort of the topics that we're going to concentrate on, like I said, pay for performance, what are some of the shortcomings that we know about vis-a-vis the single salary schedule. And I should say, I'm guessing that most of the audience knows this already, but the single salary schedule is the pay system that most school systems use, and basically it aligns pay based on a teacher's degree and experience level. So it looks like a grid, and there are different lanes for your degree level and different steps along the, different steps for experience level. We'll talk a little bit about some of the arguments for pay restructuring that are not directly connected to performance. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that school systems might want to do to kind of align their other human capital resource systems with their pay system and hopefully make compensation work better in the district, and then just finally offer a few conclusions. So the first thing that I ought to talk about is just, what do we mean by teacher quality? And teacher quality can mean a lot of things to different people. For instance, a lot of people connect quality directly to a teacher's credentials, the teacher's experience or degree level, whether they have special kinds of certifications like certification by the national board. Quality can also mean something about what you actually observe teachers doing in the classroom, their classroom practices. Increasingly, school systems are beginning to try and get a sense of the quality of their teachers based on what students say about them. So a relatively new innovation is that students are being surveyed and asked to give their perceptions of their teachers, and those get aggregated to the classroom level, and that aggregation is used as a measure of teacher quality. And then there's the direct question of whether teachers impact student learning as detected by standardized tests. And that also, I'll say I'll use that term, student growth and student learning, interchangeably with value added. But the idea of value added is that you're getting a teacher's contribution above and beyond whatever kind of a student brings to her classroom, a teacher's contribution to student learning gains on standardized tests. And one of the reasons that researchers tend to use that as a measure of teacher quality is that oftentimes there's very little variation in other measures of teacher performance. So one of the, I guess I would argue, problems that we have in the way that teachers are evaluated today is that 95 or 98% of teachers get the very same evaluation rating. And if that's the case, you can't really use that performance evaluation for making any kinds of personnel decisions. So there's more variation in student test scores, and for that reason, people often use that variation to get these value-added measures of teacher effectiveness or teacher performance. So what does the research say about teacher quality? And again, when I say teacher quality, you should think value-added, because that's kind of the default that I go to when I'm thinking about teacher quality, and it's what the research tends to focus on. So when you look at the variation in student test performance, it suggests that teachers are the most important schooling attribute that affects student achievement, and that they can have a pretty big impact. Again, schooling attributes. So what goes on in the home clearly matters a great deal too, but when you compare the impact of differences in teacher quality to other kinds of resources, like changing class sizes, you can see that the effects of changes in teacher quality are quite large. So statisticians tend to talk in standard deviation terms, and I'm gonna talk about standard deviation. So let me give you kind of a feel for what that means. If you ranked teachers according to their performance, a 1 standard deviation change in ranking is roughly equivalent to a teacher moving from the 50th percentile, so a teacher that is average effectiveness, to a teacher at the 84th percentile. An estimate suggests that differential in teacher effectiveness can have an impact on student achievement that's roughly comparable to a change in class size of 10 to 13 students. And as I'm sure you all know, a change in class size of 10 to 13 students is quite a large change in class size. You'd roughly be cutting class sizes in half or increasing them by 50%. And it's quite expensive. So if we had a way to increase the quality of the teacher workforce, it could have pretty profound impacts on student achievement. The other thing that research is pretty clear about is that the kinds of characteristics, teacher characteristics that are easy to quantify and often captured by administrative data sets, like a teacher's licensure status, a teacher's degree level and experience level, that those characteristics tend not to be very strongly correlated with their quality measured in value-added terms. And, that was a bit of a more controversial finding, 15 years ago. Today, that's a finding that has been really very well established in the research literature. So why focus on compensation? Well, there's really a couple of reasons. One, as I said, there's not much of a connection between teacher compensation and teacher quality today, because compensation is based on those characteristics and credentials that are only weakly linked to value added. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The other thing is that compensation in teaching is quite different than compensation in the private sector, although not as different from compensation systems in other public sector occupations. But the fact that compensation is out of step with the private sector can have some potentially negative consequences for the teacher labor market. And so we'll talk a little bit about that too. And then the last thing is that compensation is kind of one of the main workforce tools that you have to shape the teacher labor market, and you're essentially throwing out a major tool if you connect it only to the salary schedule and don't connect it to performance or the kind of school that you're teaching in or the kinds of specializations that a teacher might have. But as I will tell you, the evidence about connecting teacher pay to teacher performance is pretty mixed. So when we know a little bit about the single salary schedule and its weaknesses, the evidence that says here's what we ought to do instead of the single salary schedule, well, that's more fuzzy. So let me pause for a second and ask you to think a little bit about the factors influencing teacher quality and say which of the following on this next slide, whoops, I guess the slide is up there now, which of the following are true? So when you think about teacher quality, do we think that the differences between, you know what, I think actually we skipped a slide. Folks, I don't feel like I have control over the presentation.
Dan,
here's the slide we skipped. Here's the slide. I'm sorry,
Dan,
what were you saying, Elizabeth?
Sure, if you go back to slide 15, that poll is going to pop right up for them to respond to. That's what popped up on your screen.
Okay. I actually was going to. Okay. Well, why don't we go ahead and ask this question? Yeah, and then I'll talk a little bit about what the answers are. So,
sure.
When you think about the factors that influence teacher quality, do you think that the difference between teachers are about as important as other schooling factors, that the difference between teachers are connected to variables like experience, endorsements, degree? Are both of those things true, or are neither of those things true? All right, so it looks like about half of the people who have responded think that both the difference in teacher quality, that they are connected to both their credentials, and they are about as important as other schooling and classroom resources. And as it turns out, that's not the case. So the correct answer here, at least from a research perspective, is neither of the above are true. That the factors that seem to predict teacher quality are not strongly associated with a teacher's degree level endorsement, special kinds of credentials, and that teacher quality is much more important than the other kinds of investments that we can make in schools. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the upcoming slides. So this is some that I did. It's now about 15 years old, but it's actually a finding that has been replicated many, many times, that when you look at the variation in student test scores, and you try and say, how do we explain the variation in student test scores? What part of the variation that's explained by schools is explained by teachers, differences between teachers that are associated with the teachers being at certain schools, and differences between teachers that are simply associated with the differences of teachers within a school. We see that about 40% is explained by differences in the quality of teachers within schools. About 40% is explained by differences between schools, all right? And that may be the quality of the principal, it may be something about the curriculum at the school, but it also may be about the differences in quality of the teachers at the school level. And then about 20% of the differences in student achievement that's explained by schooling factors is explained by things that are going on within the classroom. So, you know, differences in the composition of the classroom and peer effects, and differences in class size. When we take the 40% of the variation in student achievement that's explained by differences in teachers within a school, and we try and figure out, well, is that about you know, the difference between Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Jones, or is it about the fact that Mrs. Smith has a master's degree and 15 years of experience, and Mrs. Jones is a novice teacher with only a BA? What we see is that mostly it is about the differences between the teachers that's not associated with their degree, their experience level. And that's the right-hand side pie. About 97% of the difference between teachers is explained by things that are not captured by the data systems that we typically use for teacher research, and by the data that is used for compensation and determining employment eligibility. So 97% of the difference in teacher quality is not associated with the teacher's degree level, experience level, certification status, and other kinds of characteristics like that. So the big message here is teachers matter. There's a lot of variation in teacher effectiveness in the workforce, and that most of that variation is not explained by the kinds of characteristics and credentials that we use for employment eligibility purposes and pay purposes. And here are some more examples that basically buttress that point. This is some work on teacher licensure test performance, and it looks at the performance of teachers who either pass or fail a licensure test in North Carolina at the elementary level. And again, I want to note that I'm going to talk about this in real cursory terms to get the point across, but if you want the details, you can go to the CEDAR website, and there's a whole research paper about this that you can download. But basically what these two distributions, there's one distribution that is a dashed line and a second distribution which is a solid line, show is the distribution of teacher effectiveness for teachers that pass or fail the licensure tests that are required to teach in North Carolina at the elementary level. So before I get into a little bit more about this, let me just explain how to interpret these graphs. First off, the 0, which you see on the horizontal axis, that doesn't mean that a teacher has 0 impact on student achievement. It means that that's a teacher who has an impact that is the equivalent to the average teacher in the state. And so if you're a teacher that is to the right of 0, you are a teacher that is more effective than average. And if you're a teacher to the left of 0, you're a teacher that is less effective than average. And these bell-shaped curves are probably familiar to people, but this is just basically the distribution of teacher effectiveness in the workforce. And it might be akin to looking at the distribution of heights of men and women. So men tend to be a little bit taller than women, and so men might be the solid distribution. And we see that there are some men that are very tall, and they would be off on the right-hand side of the distribution, and some men that are relatively short, they would be off on the left-hand side of the distribution. And the distribution of heights of women would be the dashed line. And you can see that there's a lot of overlap in these distributions, meaning that there are a lot of women that are also tall and a lot of men that are also short. I happen to fall on the left-hand side of this distribution. And yet, on average, men tend to be taller than women. So hopefully that is clear. But if it's not, maybe people could type in some comments, and I'll look for comments to see if that makes sense. I'm going to talk about a couple of these charts, so I hope that's pretty clear. So with that in mind, basically what the research did is it stacked up teachers from least effective to most effective. So again, going from the left-hand side to the right-hand side of the x-axis, and looked at the distribution of teachers who did not pass the licensure test standard, the dashed line, and teachers who did pass the licensure test standard, the solid line. And what this shows is that teachers who pass the licensure test tend, on average, to be more effective than teachers who fail. That's the little p and the little f down at right around 0 on the x-axis. But all the teachers that are in Area B, those are teachers that failed to pass the licensure test that tend to be more effective than the average teacher who passed the licensure test. And all the teachers in Area A, they are teachers who passed the licensure test but are actually more effective than, less effective than. So what this means is that if you don't know anything about teachers, all you know is someone passed or failed licensure test, and you wanted to make a bet. Is the teacher who passes the test more effective than the teacher who failed? The answer is yes. You would want to bet on the teacher who passes, but you probably would not want to bet your house, because there are lots of teachers who pass that are not actually more effective than the average teacher who failed, and vice versa. So there's some information about teacher quality, but it is certainly, you're not making a bet with a great deal of certainty when you place that kind of bet. There's a lot of research that shows that teachers become more effective, they tend to become more effective when they become more experienced. And so what this next graph shows is some work from Tom Kane and some other colleagues, and it shows how teachers become more effective, which is on the y-axis, as they gain additional years of experience, which is on the x-axis. So you can see for both teachers who are uncertified and teachers who get a traditional certification through traditional teacher training program, that they tend to become more effective with experience. And that's true for both math, which is the left-hand panel, and reading, which is the right-hand panel. But when we put this on a distribution chart, it's called a kernel density distribution, and look at the average effectiveness of novice teachers, so someone who's just coming into the profession versus fifth-year teachers, we see that there's still a lot of overlap in teacher effectiveness. So this is akin to what I just showed you for licensure, but for experience. So all the teachers in Area A, those are teachers that are fifth-year teachers, but turn out to be a little bit less, or sometimes much less effective than the average novice teacher. And all the teachers in Area B, those are novice teachers who end up being more effective, are estimated to be more effective than the average teacher with 5 or more years of experience. So again, experience, if you knew nothing about a teacher but how experienced the teacher was, you would be good to bet on the more experienced teacher as being more effective, but it's not a certain bet. A lot of times you're going to be wrong. And my guess is that these research findings comport a lot with a lot of what people just know when they go in and they talk to people in a classroom. That sometimes, you know, you can talk to a novice teacher who really just seems to have it together, and the novice teacher connects well with students. And you can talk to some, you know, experienced teachers who, for whatever reason, maybe are not so effective with their students. So that doesn't mean experience doesn't matter. Experience does seem to matter. Teachers tend to become more experienced they certainly become more experienced with experience. They tend to become more effective with experience. But it's not always the case that experience is going to give you a good ranking of a teacher's effectiveness. With degree level, there's almost complete overlap in these distributions. So whereas with teacher licensure test performance and experience, I said if you were going to bet on teachers being more effective, you'd want to know something about experience and whether they passed licensure exams. With regards to master's degree, that's not true. It turns out that having a master's degree almost, in most cases, with a few exceptions at the high school level, if you're teaching math and science, for instance, having a master's degree does not predict how effective a teacher is. So that is, and there's a lot of money that goes into paying teachers more with master's degrees. And maybe we can come back to this point when we get to question and answer. But I think that there are some plausible reasons as to why master's degrees typically don't predict teacher effectiveness, especially at the elementary level right now. So when we think about using pay to improve the teacher work, pay and evaluation to improve the teacher workforce, this is a chart that you will often see people use. And basically, it's about shifting the whole distribution to the right. We hope that we identify really ineffective teachers, give them the chance to improve, and if they don't, maybe they don't get tenured. You know, maybe they don't get renewed in the early part of their career. We hope that through evaluation that they actually improve, their skill set improves, and so there's some shifting of the distribution to the right. And we also hope that those teachers that are really highly effective, if you pay them more, if you recognize their effectiveness, that they're more likely to stay in the profession. So whereas they might have gone to a different profession in the absence of getting some kind of performance bonus, for instance, they might be more likely to stay because they say, this is a profession that recognizes you know, my excellence in the classroom, and it's a profession where I can make a you know, career and actually get a livable wage. Okay.
Okay, so at this point, we'd like to ask another open-ended question of our participants in the audience to see what you all think about the teacher-level variables that Dan just described, experience and education, and the minimal impact on quality. We want to know if this surprises you, and what do you think about that? And I do see there's a comment that came in the questions about content box, and it might be related to this question that we're asking, so if you want to type a portion of that comment here, that would be great.
You know, Elizabeth, can I speak to that comment, because I think it's an important question.
Sure.
While people are typing in their questions.
Absolutely.
So let me make sure that I read this so that people can, let's see. So there were two questions. One is just, do we have sufficient information about student background and collective effects to model basically an individual teacher's impact? And that is actually a research question that people really try and address in a variety of ways. And one of the ways that they try and address it, and actually this is one of the things that the Measures of Effective Teaching project did, is through some experiments when teachers are randomly assigned to their classroom so that we can see whether or not the estimates of teacher effectiveness look like they're the same when teachers are randomly assigned and when they are not randomly assigned. And the short answer is that, that it looks like at the elementary level that the estimates are of value added are pretty good. And that is, and there's some evidence at the middle school level too. And that perhaps is not so surprising because teaching, especially at the elementary level, you know, it's less likely to be departmentalized. Students are more likely to be in a single teacher's classroom for, you know, the majority of the day. So you might think that the team aspects of teaching are less important. When you move to the secondary level, that gets to be a lot harder to do, and the statistics associated with value added get to be a lot more difficult. And so there's less evidence about whether the statistics adequately capture a teacher's contribution to student learning, and there's more evidence that suggests that it's difficult to do. There's some great questions here. So, so Elizabeth, should I try and address some of these questions now, or do you want to hold them till the end?
Yeah, Dan, you can go ahead and address any that you think are related to what you just shared.
I'm glad people are bringing up this issue of the quality of master's programs. I think that is a huge explanation for what's going on with the master's degree and the lack of finding of an association between having a master's degree and student learning. That the way that school systems typically reward for having a master's degree, it doesn't matter what you get your master's degree in or where you get it. And so in most of the school systems that I'm familiar with, most teachers are getting a master's degree in educational administration. And that is not even a degree that sort of purports in most cases to make you a more effective teacher. It's giving you the credential that you need to move into administration. So it's not clear that the kind of skills that you're going to pick up in a master's program are going to be connected to teacher effectiveness. The area where we do see a connection between having a master's and student performance is at the secondary level. And it's when you're teaching math or science and you have a degree in math or science. So it kind of makes sense. You know, when you're teaching math and science and you know more math and science, it looks like you tend to be a more effective teacher. There's also this issue of quality, that in most cases doesn't matter where you get your master's degree. If you get a master's degree, you get the reward. So there's probably not as much of a sort of a rigorous look at, you know, from a school system's perspective about what kinds of degrees are rewarded as one perhaps might want to make sure that teachers are really getting rewarded for getting training in an area related to their teaching and for getting really good high-quality training. There's also a comment here about lumping all levels and subjects together. Important caveat. Most of the research that I'm referencing, like I said, is at the elementary level. And it's at the elementary level because the statistics are a little bit easier. You get a better linkage between teachers and their individual students. We know less about the contribution of individual teachers at the secondary level. and one would want to be careful about overgeneralization of the findings that I'm talking about, because they don't necessarily apply across the board. There's an analogy about an athletic coach, that understanding the theory and technical aspects of a sport might not actually make you more effective. And I guess I think that that's a pretty good analogy. It probably makes you marginally more effective, but training in and of itself is unlikely, I would suspect, to explain entirely whether, no matter how good the training, it's unlikely to explain entirely how effective a teacher is, because some part of being effective is going to be connected to your ability to inspire students and really connect with them, to work with them after school, to work with their parents. And those are things that, perhaps can be taught and perhaps people can improve upon. But I suspect that some of it is just about your interpersonal skills and the degree to which you come off as being a incredibly caring and inspiring teacher to your students and to their parents. And some of those traits may be very difficult to teach. Yep. Teaching is both art and science. I think that that's absolutely true.
So I think we're getting a lot of really good commentary on this, and I don't want to cut any other portion short. So I think it's a good time to move on to your discussion of pay for performance, if you're ready to do that.
Yeah, thanks for keeping me on track. I'll just say, let's come back at the end to the question of professional development, because there's actually a lot of research on professional development too. Those were some great comments. So, pay for performance. First off, let me say what I mean by pay for performance and what has been studied a great deal. So I'll use merit pay and pay for performance interchangeably. Again, most states and districts typically pay teachers according to a salary schedule that's connected to their experience and education level. Pay for performance, as it's been studied, generally means some kind of bonus that is connected directly to student gains, often on standardized tests. So it's a very particular kind of performance pay. There's lots of different ways that performance may be connected to pay, and lots of different ways that we see it connected to pay in the private sector. But the things that have been studied extensively in teaching is this particular kind of connection where it is a bonus that you get at the end of the year based on student gains on their standardized tests. In general, there is evidence, a lot of it from other countries, that connects performance pay to teacher effectiveness. It's not clear that the studies from other countries really correspond all that well to studying, teacher labor markets in the United States and the effects that we might anticipate here, because oftentimes the context is very, very different. So as an example, one of the ways that we have seen pay for performance seem to work in really high quality experiments in other countries is that teachers are absent a lot of times in developing countries from school. And one of the ways it looks like it works is to encourage teachers to come to school more regularly. And not surprisingly, when a teacher shows up on a more regular basis, students seem to learn well. But absences in the United States are far less of a problem. So again, I'm not sure that the evidence from other countries will necessarily apply here in the U.S. The evidence from non-experimental studies in the United States on pay for performance are mixed in terms of the findings. Some studies show that pay for performance seems to work and some studies show that pay for performance has very little impact on student achievement, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The experimental evidence, where teachers are randomly assigned, teachers or schools, are randomly assigned to be part of an experiment where they are eligible to get a pay for performance kind of bonus. They tend to show that there's very little impact, at least in the short run, on student achievement. And you know, a decade ago, we didn't know much about pay for performance, and I'll just kind of put my cards on the table that I would have said if someone had asked, should we be trying this kind of pay for performance? A decade ago, I would have said, yeah, I think we ought to be trying it. Today, I'm convinced from this experimental evidence that it doesn't work very well, this particular way of paying teachers, and so it's maybe not something that we ought to focus on. Something else that we know about pay for performance, teachers tend not to like it. It's contextual, so teachers in general are opposed to performance connected to student achievement gains on tests. It depends on, you know, how experienced you are. More experienced teachers are more skeptical about pay for performance than are less experienced teachers. It depends on your views on your principal. But what I've put up here on the slide is the percentage of teachers that report being in favor of different kinds of pay reforms. So the first one, which is probably a bad euphemism called combat pay, but it's what teachers tend to, the term teachers tend to recognize. And this is based on a survey of teachers in Washington State. You see that 72% of teachers favor paying more if you're teaching in a disadvantaged school setting. If you're teaching students that are arguably less well prepared to learn when they show up at the beginning of the day, you know, often called combat pay. About half the teachers are in favor, at least in the survey, we're in favor of paying more if you get a certification by the national board. Roughly 40% were in favor of paying more to teachers in hard-to-recruit subjects, typically math, science, and special education. But less than 20%, 17% in this survey, were in favor of paying teachers more if they had students that tended to show, you know, very large gains on standardized tests. So teachers, relatively speaking, they do not favor pay for performance. They're much more favorably inclined to other kinds of pay reform. I mentioned that these views are nuanced, so I don't have, I'm going to quickly gloss over the slide, but basically you're more likely to favor pay for performance if you're a novice teacher than you're an experienced teacher, and you're more likely to favor it if you have a high trust in your principal versus low trust in principal. And I think that those findings make a lot of sense when you think about whether you would think of the system being administered fairly. So here's another open-ended poll where we're basically just asking about your thoughts on pay for performance. So Peter writes that the student growth measures on standardized tests are too limited to justify it, and I know that is something that is commonly thought to be the case, and really I would argue that it's in the eye of that's sort of a statement that's in the eye of the beholder. So I think when you're thinking about changes, you want to consider how does the change look relative to what you're doing now? And it may be the case that it's judged to be too iffy, but on the other hand, we know that the way that we're paying teachers now doesn't really connect to their performance very well, especially in the case of the master's degree. Also, there was an earlier comment that teachers don't like pay for performance because they feel that they have kind of a limited impact on student test scores. And I understand that one as well. The idea of value added is that you're parsing out what teachers are contributing to student achievement gains apart from what they bring to the table. And so you're trying to take account of that. But there's a lot of disagreement as to how well these statistical models actually account for, the fact that, for instance, poor students tend to, not always, but tend to learn less from year to year than more affluent students. There's a comment about whether one of the reasons why we might see that pay for performance is not working is that it might help to change the teaching profession. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but I think that that's an insightful comment that some of the studies that suggest that it doesn't work, that they may focus on sort of the wrong way, or they focus on only one way that pay for performance might work, and that there are multiple avenues through which pay reform and pay for performance could have an impact on the teacher workforce. Yep, there are some great comments about, making sure that the measurement is good, making sure that there are other systems that support pay reform. And those are comments that are definitely insightful and that we'll talk a little bit more about later in the presentation. And there's some comments about, should the pay be targeted to an individual teacher or should it be targeted to teams? And there are studies that look at both of those issues, and so I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think that the targeting of pay for performance is an important question.
Clearly, the perceptions of pay for performance are all over the place, and people have a variety of views on this. And I think, this is representative of the public's perspectives on compensation systems. So I think it follows with the experimental evidence that, we're really mixed on this topic.
I want to really emphasize one point, that I think it's hard to make a judgment about any kind of pay reform without juxtaposing the reform against the current system. So it's easy to kind of pick at various kinds of pay reforms and identify the problems and with the reforms, and they definitely exist, and toward the end of the presentation we'll talk about some of the things that school systems might do to make reforms more successful. But it's not as if those reforms are being judged against some kind of perfect system. We know that the single salary schedule has some problems too. Now, it may be that at the end of the day, people say, yeah, single salary schedule doesn't work all that well, but it is it's safe and it's working well enough and it's easy to administer, and those may be compelling reasons to continue with it. But I do think that recognizing that we're not measuring a reform against a nirvana, perfect system is important to do. So Elizabeth, if it makes sense to you, I think I'm going to go into some of the experiments on pay for performance.
Great, thanks.
All right. So, in education, one of the things that we've learned is that oftentimes you can't get great research evidence from non-experimental studies. And the reason is that you really want to separate out the impact of a program from the kinds of people that choose to participate in the program. So let me just emphasize that point for a second. you could imagine that if you're saying to a school system, look, we're going to introduce this new curriculum. It's going to be wonderful. We're going to roll it out and let teachers decide whether they want to use it in their classroom. That some teachers, perhaps the teachers that are, the most sort of excited about it and the teachers that are most energetic, those might be the teachers that would jump on board first. And so that if you were then to look at the impact of the curriculum, and you know that it's the most excited and energetic teachers that jumped on board and were implementing the new curriculum, you might see a difference between the new curriculum and the old curriculum, but you really wouldn't know whether to attribute that difference to the curriculum itself or the fact that it is the energetic teachers that tended to jump on board first. And so for that reason, you can make the same sort of arguments about pay for performance. You want to know, is it about the system or is it about the people who decide to jump on board? And that's an argument for doing an experiment where some teachers on a randomized basis or some schools on a randomized basis get the reformed pay and some don't. So that's why I'm going to talk mainly about some really well-designed experiments. So the first experiment is this experiment that took place in New York City public schools, where schools were given, on an experimental basis, access to pay for performance. And they compared schools that got pay for performance to schools that did not. And this study showed basically no effects on student achievement in any grade level. And one of the explanations for the fact that there were no effects is that the distribution of the performance pay tended to be pretty equal in each school. And so the argument from an economist perspective might be that there was very little effect because there's not much incentive when teachers know that everyone's going to get the incentive, even no matter what their individual performance might be. And then the other argument is that maybe the incentive was too small. The actual amount in dollar terms that teachers would get was too small to actually elicit changes in behavior or effort because the distributions were all given out or mostly given out equitably. So bottom line, when there was this group-based experiment, very little impact on student achievement, impact that was not statistically detectable. Another experiment in Texas where teams of teachers who were teaching core studies, math, reading, etc., were eligible to receive a bonus. Also, very little impact. No statistically discernible effect on student achievement. You could make many of the same kinds of arguments about why there might not have been an impact related to the fact that it was a group. So you can imagine there's trade-offs. When you target groups, the advantage might be that you preserve the team and encourage collaboration at the team level. But the disadvantage is that you might have what is known as free ridership, that teachers may assume that, well, I'm going to get the bonus, but it's going to be based on how hard my colleagues work. I'm not really going to change my behavior. Or that the bonuses, when they're distributed equally, they have very little incentive effect because they are so small. So that's why I think that there's this very important additional study that's based on a pay-for-performance incentive experiment in Nashville, where teachers at the individual level were randomly assigned to be eligible to receive a bonus or not, based on the estimates of their students' achievement growth. And the bonuses were potentially quite large, up to $15,000 per year. So this moves away from the group-based incentive to an individual-based incentive, and the size of the bonus was very, very large. So it's hard to argue that it was so small as not to really provide someone with a big incentive to improve. But here again, no estimated impact on performance. And I'll say that personally, I found this study to be very influential because it addresses a lot of the criticisms about different kinds of pay for performance that I've mentioned, and suggests that, at least in the short run, no big impact. There's a lot of research that I didn't put into these slides that suggests little impact when you've got pay for performance. There's one experiment where they do find an impact. But they don't find an impact when you provide teachers an incentive, where you provide teachers the incentive to improve student achievement and then they get a bonus. No impact when you provide that kind of incentive. But it turns out that if you give teachers money up front, I believe it's $4,000, and you say, you get to keep that $4,000 if your students improve, a good deal. But if they don't, then we take the $4,000 away, that there is an impact on student achievement in that case. And so people call that loss aversion. So this is important. I think this is an important study for a couple of reasons. One, hard to imagine how you would implement such a pay reform. I just can't imagine that we would provide teachers with money up front and then say, we're going to take it away from you if your students don't improve. So I don't think that it suggests, oh, pay for performance can necessarily work. But the fact that we see that the incentive had an impact on student achievement suggests that teachers can be more effective. And so it suggests that maybe there are some things that we could do to encourage teachers to become more productive. So it's not just that they are all maxed out in a year, but that we need to figure out what are the right tools to really get teachers to work harder or smarter, even if providing them these upfront bonuses and then threatening to take them away is not a very feasible strategy. I'm going to skip through this in the interest of time. Let's see. Okay, so this is a study that I know well because of the study that I was involved with, where we looked at pay reform in Denver, ProComp, which is one of the nation's sort of very well-known pay reforms. And ProComp is many things. Pay for performance is a piece of it. Well, we found that in the case of ProComp, that when ProComp as a system was introduced, that there was a beneficial impact on student achievement. But it didn't look like that impact was concentrated necessarily amongst the teachers who signed up for the pay reform. So teachers were given the opportunity to opt into this system, and some did and some didn't. And it turned out that there were improvements across the board in student achievement. And so our conclusion is that the pay reform may have leveraged other changes in the school system in Denver that helped to increase student performance, that helped teachers, whether they were part of the pay experiment or they were not part of the pay experiment. And I just used the term experiment, but it wasn't an experiment in the experimental sense of the word, but experiment in the sense that they were trying something new. And so my takeaway from this is that pay reform itself, at least in the way that we've talked about it, may not be enough, that you got to do other things to kind of align your school systems, human resource systems with the pay reform, provide professional development, et cetera, that gives teachers a better chance to improve. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get a little further into the presentation. So Elizabeth, I'm handing it back to you.
Thanks, Dan. So after hearing about those examples, the experimental examples that Dan just shared, we want to ask you all, what are some of the reasons you think that pay for performance may not work?
And while folks are typing in some of their questions, I'm going to just respond to a couple of the issues that were raised while I was talking. So one person wrote and said that some of the ideas behind pay for performance are basically that that you got to have a carrot and stick approach, and that maybe that's not the right way to look at it. That teachers need better professional development, they need better training pre-service, and I certainly wouldn't disagree with those ideas. That said, the research evidence on pre-service training and professional development is pretty depressing in the sense that it doesn't look like the differences in professional development, for instance, that we see, more intensive professional development, teachers experimentally given professional development or not, it doesn't seem like professional development is a way that we can improve the teacher workforce either right now with the existing structure that we have. So professional development itself doesn't seem to work all that well, at least in terms of what we can detect based on student achievement. It's possible that it improves teachers in ways that don't get translated into student achievement on standardized tests. There's another comment about whether teachers are suddenly holding back, and given the right incentive, whether they would suddenly put forth more effort. And my take on this is that it's probably true that most teachers are not, holding back effort, and so incentive, providing an incentive is not going to get a lot of teachers to suddenly put forth more effort. That doesn't mean that it wouldn't work with some teachers. And the evidence that I cited about loss aversion suggests that perhaps there are some gains to incentivizing teachers in a certain way. But again, some of the other evidence about pay for performance says that simply providing a teacher at the end of the year with a bonus if their students made big improvements, that doesn't seem to work. And then there's another question about how many years of test performance would you want to make a judgment. There's actually a lot of research evidence on the number of years of test information that's useful for making judgments, and there's no magic number, but you do definitely learn more about teacher effectiveness if you have more years. And then lastly, there's a comment about staying in hard-to-staff schools. And whether pay makes a difference for staying in hard-to-staff schools. And I won't spend a lot of time talking about that, but that's one of these other kinds of pay reforms that I think oftentimes often gets lost because pay for performance is kind of the sexy topic, but is a very important way that you might want to adjust the single salary schedule. So I'll talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation. All right, so some of the questions that have come in. Let's see. School leadership and working conditions are critical. Absolutely. I think that that's true. The person also suggests that pay is not an effective motivator for many teachers. I think that that's probably right. Doesn't mean it's not an effective motivator for all teachers, but for many teachers, it doesn't seem like it's effective. Again, my take on this is that it's an empirical question, whether or not it motivates teachers, and that we have some answers. And the answers seem to suggest, at least from the experimental evidence, that simply providing the big incentive of itself doesn't have a detectable short-run impact on student achievement. Funding of pay, can we fund pay incentives? That is another important question. One of the reasons why you might not see an impact of pay reform is teachers may think this is just the reform du jour, and that a couple years down the line it's going to go away. And in fact, there was a lot of experimentation with merit pay back in the early 80s. There's a very good paper by Richard Murnane and David Cohen about this. And one of the things that they discovered is that school systems experimented with merit pay but quickly went away. It lasted for a couple of years and then went away. And that's true for a lot of reform. And if you think that something's going to just be there for a year or two and then it's going to go away, you may not change your behavior as much as you would if you thought something was going to be long-lasting. Let's see. Great comment that teachers may want to improve, but they may not know what to do differently. And a lot of the studies that I've mentioned thus far look for short-run impacts of pay for performance. And it's possible that the effects of pay reform, pay for performance, or other kinds of reform are not just short-run impacts, that we might see that there are changes to who stays in the workforce, or that over time teachers improve because they elect to go out and get the right kinds of professional development. The experimental evidence is not designed to pick up some of these longer run impacts. The experiments typically run from anywhere from 1 to 3 years, and it's possible that we just wouldn't see effects in that shorter time span. Let's see. Another good comment. Teacher beliefs about how to increase student achievement may not be correlated with actually the best ways to increase student achievement. And that would certainly explain why we didn't see pay for performance impacts. If teachers are reacting to those incentives by doing things that are not efficacious for student learning, then you wouldn't expect to see an impact on student achievement. So sort of related to, maybe we need to provide the right kinds of professional development along with pay reform. So there's this question about the inverse of the discussion. What's the research say about denying pay increases to the least effective teachers? And the short answer is that there's not much research on that, because that doesn't typically happen. But that's a little bit what this study on loss aversion does, is they say, we're gonna give you this money up front, but you're not going to get to keep it if your students don't seem to make adequate gains on tests. And again, loss aversion is where we did see an impact on student achievement. Another question about professional development, that, why don't we use money on outstanding professional development? I think we don't know what outstanding professional development is. So the topic of this webinar is not professional development, but there's really good experimental evidence on professional development too. And the bottom line is, it doesn't look like professional development has a really big impact on student achievement. Okay, sort of related to this question of professional development is having coherence in your system. So coherence in teacher preparation, professional learning, pay, coherence across the school. I think that personally, I don't think we know from a research standpoint, but personally, I think that is the right strategy. That no matter what kind of reform strategy that you are engaging in, you really want to make sure that you don't treat a single reform as if you can drop it into a school or school system and expect really big achievement gains, unless it is integrated with other systems and other changes to support the reform.
Dan, I think that you make a good point, in a juncture that we're all at in the state of the transition to the Common Core standards, is that districts and states are looking at ways to create those functional, systematic reforms that will bridge the professional learning piece with the assessments, with the new standards, with curriculum initiatives. So I think that everyone's kind of looking at all these pieces together right now, and it's probably overwhelming, and why many people are here and really engaged in the conversation about this topic.
Yeah, yep. And again, I think that it's overwhelming, but probably essential that you do multiple things to try and improve the effectiveness of the teacher workforce. That what we've learned is, look, professional development alone, pay alone, that those things typically just a single intervention alone doesn't seem to have a big effect.
So we're going to move the question box out of the screen because I know people are really engaged in this, but we do have a little bit more information for Dan to share, and we can circle back to some more comments and questions when we get to the Q&A session.
Yeah, I just want to throw out a couple of reasons. Oftentimes, and I suspect it's to a different audience, but if you talk about this research with an audience of private sector people in the business community, for instance, and you say pay for performance in education doesn't seem to work, well, that puzzles them because it's much more common in the private sector. So I just want to throw out a couple of possible reasons why pay for performance of the sort that we've talked about thus far, big caveat, might not seem to work. Well, one we've already talked about, that simply doing pay for performance alone, that's not enough. That's this second box down. But the other is that teachers may be in teaching they certainly are in teaching for reasons other than just pay, and that it's possible that if you implement a pay for performance system, that you are in certain psychological ways diminishing some of the value that people get out of teaching because they worry that either other people will perceive them as being sort of in it for the money, or that they themselves might perceive their actions as being related to compensation for why pay for performance might not work. Then the other thing that I think is very important, and we've already talked about it largely talked about this, is that maybe pay for performance does work, but it's just not it's not the kind of pay for performance that we've looked at, or again, these sort of bonuses, or that research has been looking for the wrong things, a short-term impact on student achievement gains from one year to the next. So maybe it takes time for teachers to change their practices because they need to learn what to do, or because they need to really be convinced that a reform is here to stay. It's not just going to be gone next year. Maybe it's not about, pay for performance shouldn't be structured in the way that it has in these experiments where you just get some kind of big bonus, but that, perhaps you get promoted into a different kind of position where you get more compensation, you may get a different recognition, you may get different different responsibilities, but still pay is connected to those, that differentiated career path, and that is a different kind of pay for performance, and that kind of pay for performance may well restructure the effectiveness of the teacher workforce too, but in a different way than what we've looked for. So, for instance, maybe the way that it works is by paying more effective teachers who have been identified as being more effective. You pay them more, you promote them, you recognize them, et cetera, and they're more likely to stay. So it's not about providing them a big bonus, but it's about differentiating their pay based on effectiveness to encourage them to stay in the profession. So I spent, the lion's share of my time talking about pay for performance, but I want to not lose sight of the fact that there are some other arguments that I think are pretty important for thinking about pay reform. One is that it is consistently harder to recruit and retain teachers in certain subjects. So we typically see that school systems have a more difficult time recruiting and retaining teachers in special education and in math and science. And it's not hard to imagine why that's the case. Special education maybe a harder job, and so teachers may well burn out faster. In math and science, you've got lots of other opportunities outside of the teaching profession, and so a lot of people who get degrees in math and science are perhaps trying to figure out how much they're willing to trade off to become a teacher, and they would be sacrificing a lot more if they stay in the teaching profession than someone with a degree in English. And there is, so for those reasons, for those kinds of labor market reasons, you may want to differentiate pay according to your subject and sort of specialization. And there's not much evidence of the impact of that. Probably the best study looks at a bonus that was paid in North Carolina to math and science and special education teachers who were teaching in high poverty schools. And this study found that there was a statistically significant impact on reducing turnover in those schools. And then the second thing, which is not related to a teacher specialization, is this issue of sort of high-need schools and perhaps places where students are not as well prepared to learn, and maybe they tend to be schools in tougher neighborhoods. That those schools, again, have much higher rates of teacher turnover. They typically have many fewer applicants when a job is posted. And so there are some powerful reasons to think that if you paid teachers more to teach in those schools, that's one way of providing them with sort of what's known as by economists as a compensating differential for the difficulty of the job. Again, not much evidence about that kind of reform. All right, so sadly, we've talked a lot about what doesn't work. So I want to kind of switch gears and try and think a little bit about maybe what could or what could help pay reform work better. So I can't emphasize enough about thinking about integration across different systems and thinking about the reasons why you're changing your pay system. So if you're changing your pay system to encourage greater effort, well, that's a real sort of short-run change, and you really want to measure effort well and make sure that you have, for instance, identified which students are teaching with which teachers for how long during a day. And as simple as that sounds, lots of school systems that are doing pay reform, they don't have the ability to do that. I'd argue that that's pretty important for some kinds of pay reforms. Also, if you're going to be providing teachers with incentives for student achievement, then you probably want to make sure that you're guarding against unintended consequences, often known as sort of Campbell's Law, that you get these unintended consequences where the intervention ends up perverting the outcome that you're looking for. Excuse me. So we've probably all heard a lot about the cheating scandals that have taken place in D.C. and Georgia and elsewhere. Well, I think that was that those scandals, they could have been predicted, and there are ways to guard against those kinds of there are ways to guard against cheating. So you'd want to think about the system more broadly when you're implementing pay reform to make sure that, again, in the case of pay for performance, that you had some kind of auditing function that was well established before you embarked on a reform to guard against some of the negative consequences that you might worry about. Another negative consequence that would be especially true at the secondary level is worrying about collaboration and teamwork. So I think that there are some good reasons why you would want to have a pay system that targeted individual teachers, but you might also want to have a component of it be targeted to the group to encourage teamwork, and perhaps some part of the system would explicitly account for the degree to which you are a good collaborator and help to improve your colleagues' performance too. So things that I think districts might want to explicitly think about when they're thinking about pay system is the the purpose of reforming your pay system. So I talked about a couple of different purposes. Again, the sexy one is pay for performance, and that's certainly one kind of purpose. And we've talked a lot about the fact that there are different forms of pay for performance, and you might expect different outcomes, both short run and long run, from the different forms. But that it's not just about performance. That you may want to change your pay system because you want to encourage teachers to stay in disadvantaged schools. You may want to change your pay system because you want to encourage teachers in difficult to staff subjects to stick around because turnover is costly to a school system. You might want to encourage pay reform because you want to change the career path of teachers and develop a different kind of structure where you had mentor or master teachers that help to support more junior teachers. So there are a lot of different ways that you can imagine pay reform impacting the teacher workforce and ultimately student achievement. It's really good to think through clearly what is the theory of action and how do we support that theory of action with other data systems in a school system. And these other data systems can be, the data system I talked about that defines how long students are with teachers in a day and in a year. The data system, the system might be your human resource and professional development system, making sure that teachers get feedback about their performance that is individualized so they know how to improve, and making sure that they have access to good professional development in the areas that are identified in needs of improvement. And then ultimately, I think since we don't know precisely why some systems like Denver's look like they are working, we want to make sure to have some benchmarks in place to judge whether a system is working or not. Because the politics of this, and I'll just say I used to be on a school board, so I kind of know the politics around any kind of reform, are such that there's a tremendous pressure to call any kind of reform a success before it has even fully been implemented, and certainly once it's been fully implemented. So I would say at the outset, you kind of want to go into a reform saying, we hope it's going to be successful, we think it's going to be successful, but here are some ways that we're going to judge whether it's going to be successful. And if it's not, perhaps modify the system. So Elizabeth, I'm going to throw it back to you for some of these open-ended questions.
Sure. So I think we're actually going to skip this next set of questions. There is some good food for thought for you all out there. We've talked a lot and you've shared a lot about some of the existing systems, but for the sake of time, I do want to move on, and Dan will just wrap up with the conclusions, and then we'll have another open-ended question to help you think about some action steps you all intend to take.
Okay, so these are the big takeaways. There are really good theoretical reasons why you'd want to change teacher pay systems. As I said, the characteristics and credentials that we use to reward teachers right now are only weakly at best correlated with student achievement. And it's pretty clear that the single salary schedule is not only out of step with pay in the broader labor market, but it's increasingly more out of step. So there are big changes, and I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but there are big changes in the way that people in the private sector have been paid over the last 30 years. And so the single salary schedule was less out of step with the private sector in the 70s than it was in the 90s or the 2000s. But I think that it's probably going to be increasingly difficult to get the most talented people into teaching and keep them in teaching unless there are some changes to the way compensation works. And then what do we know about pay for performance? I'm pretty convinced from the experimental evidence that that we don't see that these big performance bonus systems, whether they are targeted at a group level, a department or school level, or targeted to individual teachers, lead to short-run increases in student achievement. Lastly, we talked about some of the reasons why that might be the case, and we talked about the fact that there's some evidence, Denver was the one that I mentioned, where pay for performance and other kinds of reforms implemented concurrently seem to have had an impact on student achievement. So hopefully the glass is half full, not half empty. Lastly, I'd argue it's too early to write off pay for performance, although I personally write off the big performance bonus type of pay for performance, because we don't know whether a integrated pay reform system that pays more effective teachers more might lead to workforce sorting effects, where the teachers that are chronically ineffective decide, even though I may not be dismissed because I'm ineffective, this is just not the occupation that suits me best, and so I'm going to leave because I'm getting very low pay increases. And the teachers that look like they are quite effective decide, you know what, I'm getting pretty good rewards, and my pay keeps getting stepped up year after year, so I'm going to stick it out in the teaching profession, even though I may have some good opportunities outside of teaching. And then lastly, there's this issue of other kinds of pay reform and thinking about pay reform more generally than just pay for performance. And I leave that as my last point because I think that that's one of the really important ways that you'd want to think about pay reform. And it often gets lost because pay for performance is the topic that grabs people's interest. But that one of the things that we know is that disadvantaged students, whether you're disadvantaged students are often taught by the teachers that are tend to be of lower quality, whether that is judged by their credentials or more directly based on value added. And so it's those students that really need access to the most effective teachers that are least likely to have them. And one of the ways that we might think about changing that situation is by changing the pay system.
Thanks, Dan. We do want to ask one final question of the participants to see how they're going to take this information back to their states or school districts and consider what's been learned today and what action steps people plan to take as a result.
So while I was speaking, there were lots of comments, people's views about pay for performance and pay reform in general. And I'll just note a couple of these. Collaboration is often hindered by individual teacher accountability, and I think that is a plausible hypothesis, but not one that I personally think we know enough about. I think that there's, like I said, there's sort of two poles. That on the one hand, you don't want to discourage collaboration. On the other hand, if you don't provide some incentive to individuals to improve, then they may not. You're not providing incentive. And so I just don't think we know how to strike the right balance yet with regards to group incentive or individual incentives. Teacher attraction and retention is a great impetus for change just to the way that teachers are paid. but merit pay isn't the right way to go, and that's certainly a valid view. I will just throw out there that I think that recruitment and retention is really important, and that part of that might be connected to merit pay in a different form. Not the kind of merit pay that I've discussed here, but merit pay where, merit pay is probably not the right term, pay for performance where teachers over a number of years are recognized for their excellence and may be promoted into a different kind of position where they get additional pay, and that hopefully that helps to keep them in the profession. And actually, that's sort of connected with an earlier comment that you want to provide teachers with career pathways that don't take them out of teaching. And yeah, I think that's very important that teachers hit a certain point where in some school systems, the way that they would get a big promotion and a big pay bump is by moving into administration. And that might be quite useful for some people because the skills as administrators could be valuable too. On the other hand, for some people, you're taking a really excellent teacher out of the classroom and maybe they're successful as an administrator, but maybe they're not.
And Dan, to add to that, I would say that a benefit to that approach is that you have then effective teachers sharing their instructional strategies or their expertise with other teachers in a different forum. So peers sharing their professional learning, and that then influencing other teachers to become effective. So I think that there's some merit in looking at some systems that may be doing that. Do you know of any?
I know of school systems that have more of a career ladder, and the one place that you might look, I'm trying to remember the name of the school system. Maybe it's Eagle or Douglas County, Colorado is one that I'm thinking of. Historically, Tennessee, the state, this is back in the late 80s or early 90s, had a teacher career ladder, and there's been some empirical research on that career ladder, and it suggested that that teachers, it did keep high quality teachers in the classroom. And again, that was a kind of pay for performance, but it wasn't these merit pay bonus kind of systems. There's some of the comments that are popping up. I'll just say that there's sort of some strong views about what we do or don't know about pay reform, and my take is that we don't know a ton. So I understand that people have strong views, but I will say that from a researcher perspective, I think that the modeling techniques to try and determine value added, for instance, that they are imperfect, but that they tend to be a better gauge of teacher performance than the kinds of credentials that we're using today. So imperfect doesn't mean it shouldn't be used. I would say that you need to think about the alternatives against the existing system. So I didn't mention this, but there's a very influential and terrific study by a guy named Raj Chetty and some colleagues. And what they show is that measures of teacher value added, they definitely predict, lots of studies show that those measures predict student achievement on standardized tests. But really, that's not what we care about. We only care about standardized tests because we think that standardized tests are predictive of the opportunities that students might have later on in their lifetime. And what's important about this Raj Chetty et al. Study is that they look not only at standardized tests, but they look to see whether value added is connected with things like the probability of graduating from high school, the probability of going to college, the probability of being employed, your labor market earnings. And in fact, it's predictive of lots of those things. So I do think that there's some good evidence that validates value added. But the degree to which that is validated is certainly something that people can debate. Okay. Let's see.
So Dan, I think we're going to wrap up this portion and just use about 3 to 5 minutes to do some final questions. I know we've had a lot of really rich discussion throughout the webinar, and if people do have additional questions, we'll take those now. And if there are any we haven't been able to get to, just so everyone knows, we will be putting out an FAQ document after the webinar. Sometime next week, you'll see that on the REL Mid-Atlantic website. And that will have the responses to any of the questions people have asked ahead of time in the registration for this webinar, and any that we have addressed through the webinar and any we have not been able to address. So that'll be a good resource for everyone to check back and look at, and it will have some of the additional resources in addition to responses to the questions. So we'll put up another poll box there for people to share any last questions.
Hey, just into the blank space, I just want to make sure I get in that it was great to chat with you all, and there were some great comments and questions. Yeah.
Dan, we did have one question. I don't think we touched as much on it, and maybe you can just briefly respond to this. One of the questions that came in during registration was related to restructuring pay systems and the relation to collective bargaining. So what is the relationship between the two in developing a pay system?
Well, certainly if you live in a state where there's collective bargaining, then a lot of the details of a pay system are part of the collective bargaining agreement. So you basically have to negotiate it, and it's built into the collective bargaining agreement. In fact, Seattle just this last week adopted a new collective bargaining agreement, and one of the very contentious issues was pay and evaluation reform. So it's got to be part of the negotiation is the bottom line.
Great, thanks. I think many of the questions that people are asking or have been asked, we've touched on throughout the session, and it looks like it's been really informative for people. So, like I said, we will put up that FAQ document, and that will be a resource for everyone to check back and refer to. And at this time, I'll actually take everyone to the place where they can find some additional conversation about this topic and other topics related to the teacher effectiveness conversation.
Elizabeth, could you also, if you get a chance, to just send the CEDAR website address to people so that they know where they can get the details of the studies that are cited?
Sure. I'm going to advance to that slide. It's right here. And so people should have that. If they downloaded the PowerPoint, they have that easily accessible. And then everyone should have seen a website just open on their screen, I hope. Maybe not?
Yep. Yep.
Okay, so the teacher effectiveness forums, you should be able to navigate through that screen, and what is here is a forum for each of the topics for the webinars we've done, and we just went live with this recently, so it's a good resource for participants to go in and continue this conversation. And we can't promise that Dan will be available to respond and engage in the conversation on a regular basis, but it is a place where you can engage with one another and post comments, questions, resources, and keep that discussion going beyond today's webinar. I would also encourage you, if you do have additional questions, there's our contact information for the REL Mid-Atlantic staff, and then Dan's personal email address where you can contact him with questions. There's the additional information about our forum. And wrap up, we'll be showing a brief video closing the session, and we thank you all for attending, and we do sincerely hope that you'll attend in our October sessions.
We've now come to the end of our webinar, but the conversation isn't over. In fact, it may be just beginning. Please complete the evaluation form following today's webinar. Your feedback will help us improve future webinars. I'd like to invite you to use the REL Mid-Atlantic website as a hub for continuing the conversation. There are some great resources listed there as well, including links to material from the What Works Clearinghouse. And for webinar participants in the REL Mid-Atlantic region, you'll also find links to state coordinators. You can contact them for assistance or more information about the REL. Thanks again for joining us today.